I want to next transition us to two colleagues that I have the privilege of working with quite a bit at the Energy Action Network, Sarah Wolfe and Jared Duval. Sarah and Jared are gonna provide a really important sort of baseline foundational framework, as I mentioned, in terms of where are we at in the state of Vermont. I think Bill did a really good, sobering job of setting the framework in terms of the challenge we face when we're talking about climate. Sarah and Jared are going to bring it back down to the local level in terms of we here as Vermonters, what can we do? We have really strong statutory climate and clean energy goals. We are radically short of meeting them. Sarah and Jared are going to set that sort of really essential framework and then focus us on where we should be putting our energy in terms of where are the opportunities, where are the levers, where are the technology pathways. So Sarah Wolfe and Jared Duval, please come on up. And we will have time for a few questions for these guys afterwards too. And down the road, these amazing partners of ours will be doing more webinars with them as they get into more detail about their work. Thanks.
Thanks, Joey. Good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to be back in my hometown of Fairleigh. My name is Jared Duval. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Action Network and also the Vice Chair of the Montpelier Energy Committee.
And I'm Sarah Wolfe. I'm the Network Director of the Energy Action Network and also a representative from the Northfield Energy Committee.
So, as Joey said, one of the things that we want to do with you this morning is come from the global perspective that Bill started with down to the state level of what's happening here in Vermont, what are our goals and commitments, where do we stand in terms of meeting them, and then why does that matter not just for Vermont and the example we set in the lives of Vermonters, but why does that mean for the country as a whole in the arc of the overall clean energy and climate movement? So, as just some basic introduction, many of you are already familiar with the Energy Action Network, but I want to just say that EAN is over 200 businesses, nonprofit organizations, public state agency partners, many of whom are in the room. And we were founded in 2010 based on what's called a collective impact model. The idea is that so often when you read national news about energy, it is siloed. Oftentimes we use the terms energy and electricity interchangeably, and there'll be a conversation about our electric future here and our transportation future here and how we heat our homes and buildings over here. And we realized that the leaders of the Energy Action Network and across the state back in 2010 that we needed to come together and have a total energy conversation, because we can only understand our energy challenges and opportunities when we're looking at all of our energy sources. We also, so the role that we play, Sarah and I and Rob Fish, our dashboard manager, are the three backbone staff that support that broad network of organizations across the state. And we commit to doing a few things that help inform just our progress as a state. One is doing objective tracking using official data sources from across the state, Department of Public Service, VTrans, Agency of Natural Resources, Energy Information Administration, so that we can see where we stand relative to our commitments. And we also commit to serving as a neutral convener. While our network in the state has made really clear commitments in terms of 90% renewable by 2050, the governor is committed to the Comprehensive Energy Plan, to the Paris Agreement. Once you get into how you do that, there's oftentimes a diversity of opinion about the best path forward. And so we do not take a position on policy issues, but commit to be that objective tracker of progress and a neutral convener of diverse perspectives about how we get to those shared goals as a state.
So we're going to get into a little bit of that tracking that we provided in our last annual progress report, which you can find at the tables as you came in if you didn't already get it, and some of what's going to come in our next progress report, which is going to be coming out in early March of 2019. So we can actually tell a really positive story about where we've come from on renewable energy, and that's thanks to so many leaders that are in this room and that have come before us. We went from 12% renewable overall in 2010 to 20% in 2017. That's a big gain in just a few years. We're on track to meet the first milestone of the Comprehensive Energy Plan, which is 25% renewable energy across the total energy spectrum, transportation, thermal, and electric, by 2025. And we've done that together. We've done that growing industry in Vermont and bringing in new leaders. But as you can see, and as Bill said better than I can, we've got a steep curve ahead of us if we're going to meet the 90% renewable energy goal by 2050. So let's break this down a little bit and see where we can actually make progress and where we're falling behind. It starts really importantly with efficiency. This is two different ways of tracking where we need to go on efficiency across this total energy spectrum. The Comprehensive Energy Plan, again, calls for a reduction of over 30% in our total energy use by 2050. What that essentially means is that we're trying to use less energy so that the amount we have to make up with renewables is less. If we tried to do 90% of our current load, that'd be significantly more renewables that we'd have to build and integrate into our system. So we need to drastically reduce our energy use. And again, that's across all of the energy sectors. So finding more efficient options as we're transitioning into renewables in the thermal sector, in heating systems, in transportation and electric vehicles, which is really, really important, those two sectors, because as you can see, they are our biggest energy hogs. These pie charts are scaled to size, so the largest pie chart is our biggest energy user, that's the thermal sector, followed closely behind by the transportation sector. Those two pies, as you can see, are also the least renewable. We've only got 20% renewable in the thermal sector. That's mostly due to the number of homes in Vermont who heat with cordwood, and just 5% in the transportation sector, and that's unfortunately mostly due to ethanol, which comes in at the federal level. We have made significant progress on the electric sector. That's really what's contributed to most of our progress getting to that 20% of the total energy figure. But as you can see, it's the smallest figure. It's the smallest total energy use in the total energy spectrum.
One of the key challenges we face, though, is that as we're making progress, and as Vermont has made significant progress on efficiency and renewable electricity, meanwhile, our emissions have been going in the wrong direction, and that's because of those two large energy pies that Sarah just talked about, which contribute 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our transportation and our thermal energy use. And so this is a chart that pulls the data from the latest emissions assessment from the Agency of Natural Resources, showing the sources of our emissions in Vermont. And the ones that are highlighted in green are our energy sources. Over 80% of our emissions come from energy use in this state. And in terms of why we're making progress on renewable electricity but not with emissions, it's because the emissions that come from our electric generation and use are currently only 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're going to have hope to make a dent and bend the curve both up to 90 by 50, and to meet our emissions commitments, whether it's the Paris Agreement, whether it's the more ambitious emissions commitments outlined in the Comprehensive Energy Plan or in Vermont statute, it's very clear that because of this increase that we see now, in the last 2 years, emissions across Vermont have increased 10%, or I should say from 2013 to 2015, emissions increased 10%. And a lot of international reporting uses 1990 as a baseline. Vermont's emissions are up 16% since 1990. And that's for two reasons. Again, the electric sector, it has a relatively small share of our emissions, and it was already very low emissions back in 1990. The challenges come from the increasing use of fossil fuel in our transportation and our thermal sectors, which, because we've made so much progress making our electric sector more renewable, we can make incredible progress in those sectors by electrifying them and also doing other things that are not necessarily electrification, but things around weatherization, efficiency, advanced wood heat, in some limited applications, biodiesel, etc. Let me just get to the next page. And so one of the things that EAN has been really focused on is, as Bill was saying, it's not enough to talk about 2050 anymore. We need serious action right now. And so we wanted to bring the horizon forward of saying not just where do we stand on the path to 90 by 50, but what is it going to take this year, next year, and the year after to make sure we hit meet some of these shorter term commitments. And the closest one to us is the Paris commitment. 2025, It requires a 26 to 28% reduction in our state's emissions if we're going to stay in on the Paris Agreement, which the Governor Scott has committed to. The problem is that as of 2015, our emissions are only 2% below the 2005 baseline that the Paris Agreement talks about. So we need to go from 2% below 2005 levels to 26 to 28% below 2005 levels in just the next 7 years to meet this first and very important upcoming commitment that the state has made.
So as Jared said, we don't, as EAN, advocate for a specific policy on how we actually could meet those goals. But what we wanted to do was provide some clear drivers, some clear methods that we could get to the Paris Climate Accord. And so in our last progress report, we identified 10 drivers that are known and working technologies here in Vermont that we can identify as solutions to get us to the Paris Climate Accord target. And you can see those here, but unfortunately, after we published the progress report this summer, the revised emissions figures came out and showed us that it was 62% harder to meet these targets than we'd originally calculated. And so we haven't provided a full new model, but here are some examples of the level, the scale of adoption that we need to see across these drivers in order to meet Paris from our current 2015 levels. Something like 90,000 electric vehicles on the roads. That's in addition to what we have today. 87,000 more advanced cold climate heat pump systems. 80,000 additional homes weatherized. 500 megawatts of additional solar. 200 megawatts of wind. And then 10% from other drivers, either things that aren't yet working in the state, increased adoption beyond these figures, or other factors that could play in, like fewer heating degree days. This is really daunting. Not gonna lie about that. But the exciting part for me and the hopeful part for me is that we've made progress in the past on the electric sector, which, as Jared said, gives us the tools and gives us the platform to make this important progress in the transportation and thermal sectors.
And we have some significant examples of transformational change in a really short time frame. For instance, we recently just hosted a speaker series looking at the history of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the possibility to expand that. And one of the things that became clear is that all of the states in the Northeast that have participated in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, in less than a decade, emissions from the electric sector have been cut in half. So there are models for how to do this. The key thing, though, is whether we look regionally at RGGI or whether we look at Vermont in terms of the progress we've made in efficiency and the share of our electricity that's coming from renewables, we've been able to do that because we've had policy and regulatory requirements that mandate it. And so one of the ways that we distinguish between different policies across the energy spectrum is to say, is it a goal, is it a commitment, or is it a requirement with carrots and sticks and laws and requirements and teeth to actually get something done? As I said, RGGI and the Renewable Energy Standard, our efficiency progress, those have been made because there have been legal requirements to do so. In terms of our emissions, though, most of these have been in the area or the realm of goals or commitments that are not legally binding and do not provide the sufficient regulatory carrots and sticks, incentives and requirements to make sure that we get there. So we have statutory greenhouse gas goals that the legislature has passed that we have blown by with little repercussion, at least politically. There's certainly repercussion to that in terms of what that means for health, in terms of our share of responsibility at a per capita level for the climate problem. And then we've seen really strong commitments that different political leaders have made in the state. From Governor Shumlin to Governor Scott committing to the Comprehensive Energy Plan, committing to the Paris Agreement. But without the right policy and regulatory tools in place, our analysis shows that we're going to continue falling far short. And until and unless we have economy-wide requirements for emissions reduction that also touch on the biggest sources of our energy use and emissions in the transportation and thermal sector, we're going to continue falling far short of our state commitments and what's needed for us to be responsible national and global actors. The good news is that it's possible to do that. So we've done some recent analysis comparing Vermont's path to those of all the other 50 states. And what can we learn from other states, and what can we learn from provinces in Canada that have been more successful at reducing emissions? This graph, what you see is Vermont's emissions having increased since this might be since, I can't actually see the graph, 1990, thank you. And there are 7 states that have achieved double-digit declines in their emissions below their 1990 levels that we thought we're looking at. Now, some of these aren't the best comparisons because the reason they had such a significant decline is because they were so coal-dependent to start with. Delaware, for instance, the reason that they're the biggest percentage decline is because they transitioned a lot of their electric sector off of coal and towards natural gas and then renewable options as well. So it's not just about the percentage reduction, it's also about the per capita emissions. Vermont in 1990, we started with the 2nd lowest per capita emissions of any state in the country. We're now the 5th lowest. We've been going in the wrong direction. But when you combine these two sources of analysis, where are we seeing the biggest emissions declines and which states have the lowest per capita emissions, we see that there are really 3 states that are worth looking at to see how they've made more progress than us, because they have both lower per capita emissions than us and have managed to get below their 1990 emissions levels. And those are California, New York, and Massachusetts. I would just say, for context, if you look at New York at 8.5 tons per person of emissions, or California at 9.3, those might look good. But if we're going to meet the goals that the state has set, the Paris Agreement that we're talking about nationally and internationally, it's more about getting to a level of 2 tons per person.
So there's a common narrative around that I'm sure you've all heard, that if we do this, if we take action on climate, we're going to hurt our economies. I'm here to tell you that there's just not evidence of that. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but a few examples from the world. In California, since the Great Recession, their economy has rebounded aggressively. It's been one of the strongest economic growths in the country. In 2012, was it? They joined the Western Climate Initiative. And you saw that their emissions dropped, but their economy didn't. Their economy kept growing. It was not negatively impacted by the drop in emissions, by their action on climate. And the Western Climate Initiative is an aggressive climate policy. It caps emissions in the transportation, thermal, and electric sectors. So it's 85 to 90% of their emissions from their economy. It's a similar story when we look at Quebec, our neighbors to the north, who joined the Western Climate Initiative in 2012. Their greenhouse gas emissions have declined, and their GDP has continued to grow. So this is not to imply causality, but it's to say that there's clearly no real-world evidence that shows that our economies are going to be hurt when we enact strong carbon policies.
And the same can be said for the RGGI states and for other countries that have done other either cap and trade or carbon pricing models as well.
But unfortunately, when we look at Vermont, it's not the same story. We've had sluggish economic recovery since the Great Recession, and our greenhouse gas emissions are sharply on the rise right now. But we not only have an imperative to act on this, as Bill just made incredibly clear, as I know you all know, but we really stand to gain, and we want to go through just a few of the ways.
One of the ways that we think is a particularly sobering way to see this is if you look at the last 20 years of the prices of the different ways that we can heat our homes. If you look at those top 2 lines, the roller coaster lines in purple and light blue, those are the most volatile, highest cost ways that you can heat a home. The top one is propane, the next one is fuel oil. If instead you look at the bolded orange and dark and light green lines, those are the renewable options. Those are at a commercial and an institutional scale, heating with wood chips, or at a residential scale, heating with wood pellets, or the line that starts a little bit later because the technology is newer, cold climate heat pumps. Those are much more stable price paths to be on for family budgets rather than worrying about a $2,000 fuel oil bill in the middle of winter. And they're also far more, they're not as volatile as the fossil fuel options. So imagine the amount of money that Vermonters have spent in the kind of volume of those two propane and fuel oil curves that could, instead of going out of state, approximately 80 cents on every dollar that we spend on fossil fuel leaves Vermont and goes to what Bill was talking about, Saudi Arabia and Russia and other places. Instead, when we're on those renewable lines, using local wood, supporting local foresters, loggers, truckers, supporting our efficiency installers, supporting local clean energy businesses and utilities, much more of that money is staying and recirculating in-state and supporting our neighbors instead, and helping grow the Vermont economy.
So speaking to those UVM students in the corner, those jobs are a huge benefit that we have here in Vermont. The clean energy jobs make up 6% of Vermont's workforce. That's the highest share of the workforce across the country. The jobs did decline a little bit from 2016 to 2017, but it's still at that 6% figure. It's strong, and we expect those to continue growing.
And so, in partial summary, one of the things that we think is really important is that we don't tell a one-dimensional story about Vermont's energy and climate path. There are things that have happened that we should be incredibly proud of, and are examples of our leadership and the hard work that many of you around this room have done. We can point to the increase from 12% renewable energy overall back in 2010 to 20% as of 2017. We have relatively low per capita emissions, the most clean energy jobs per capita of any state, on and on. Those are important things to lift up and recognize. But it's also true that there are important ways, when we're honest with ourselves, that we are falling behind. Our emissions have increased 16% since 1990. We have the second highest per capita use of fuel oil of any state in the country. And we are incredibly dependent on fossil fuel for heating and transportation, and it doesn't need to be that way.
So why does this matter? Let's bring it back to the global level, or at least the national level again. When we look at those three states that Jared pulled out, California, New York, and Massachusetts, and we look at their median incomes and their population densities, Vermont's is significantly lower on both accounts and significantly closer to the US average. This matters because Vermont can show that as a rural and median income economy, we can make this change and benefit our economy and our people here in Vermont.
Because one of the greatest problems that we would have as a country in terms of our politics and in terms of our ability to make forward progress would be if the clean energy and climate transition is seen to be something that is for coastal or wealthy or elite states. What Vermont can show as a middle-income rural state is not only how this energy transformation can benefit Vermont and Vermonters, but provide a model for other rural and middle-income states across this country that we're going to need, both in terms of their energy use, their emissions, and politically, if we're going to get the scale and pace of change that's so desperately needed.
So I know we want to make time for this important announcement and get you to your workshop. So we're going to unfortunately skip questions. We will be around all day, and we'll be following up with more webinars on this information. So find us and stay tuned.